Hello, everyone. My name is Camilla Rogers. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I appreciate many of you have had probably quite as busy a day as I have, and this might be a moment for you to invest in yourself, to reconnect. So before we go through what we'll be talking about today, I think it's a good opportunity to just get 2 feet on the ground, or if you're lying down somewhere more comfy than I am, just to take a moment to have a few grounding breaths, because I think sometimes we can kind of get caught up in the stress and the busyness of the evenings. So with all breath work, the best thing to do is to breathe in through the nose and exhale through the mouth, and always make that exhale a tiny bit longer. So I'm going to do it myself as well, just to ground myself and get myself ready. So and just shake it out a little bit. Sometimes we find ourselves wearing our shoulders as earrings at the end of the day, and we're very tense and tight. So today we are talking about burnout and the preventative measures we can take, because as much as burnout is a real challenge, it's something that has become more and more apparent as we lead these always on, ever busy lives. And the good news is that it is something we can prevent. So that starts with awareness. And today's session will talk you through what burnout is and what it isn't. We'll look at and we'll zone in a bit on the stress and how we can regulate that better. Give you some practical tools and techniques you can use to show up and, really be yourself, and actually, tap into who you are as an individual in order to work out where you're at on the burnout curve and take those steps to stop it getting any worse. So I'm going to come off share screen, because the way I like to start this sort of stuff is to be a bit open and be a bit vulnerable, actually. I appreciate many of you have shared with me on your sign up forms today, excuse me. I appreciate many of you have shared that you're in a place of burnout. You suspect you're experiencing burnout. You're worried about some of the symptoms you're experiencing. And I thank you for sharing that. But I want you to know that I have been here. I really, really have been here. And I totally get it. So I'm going to give you, from a context standpoint, a quick background into that, because it helps set the scene and it can help us to learn and move forwards throughout the session. So I now help ambitious people. Sorry, I have a real frog in my throat. I now help ambitious people to optimize their performance without burning out, because of the background that I had. So I think that's probably the first point to make. And I really spent the early years of my life kind of moving around a lot, being the new girl all the time, and having a lot of energy expended around wanting to fit in, needing to start afresh. So there's a lot of doing, and there was a lot of kind of, need to impress, to be liked, and so forth. And that consistency was kind of my norm, and that's what I got used to. It helped me in many ways. I think it helped me to be very resilient, but it definitely came with its challenges. And then move forward through my university years and education. I worked really hard and had a few moments where burnout, probably as a young kid, was kind of on the horizon. I spent my years at university at Sussex studying economics, and I spent a year living in Seville, in the most beautiful city, but not speaking the language and having to study economics with fifth-year students when I was a second-year student. So again, a real kind of challenge that I had to overcome. And fast forward into my work career, I spent 10 years, near enough 10 years at HSBC, and that's where I experienced my first burnout. And it was towards the end of that period of time. And for me, my values were no longer being met. You know that feeling when you just disconnect with your job and you feel really unmotivated or just misaligned? There's a bit of a dislocation between who you are and what you're doing day to day. Well, that was me. And I genuinely had those moments in mind of, well, is this all my life has really got to? Is this all I'm really capable of? Is this it? And I think I'd reached something which we'll touch on later, called a moral injury burnout, or it's often referred to as worn out burnout. And often this is very much when it comes to this identity crisis, if you want, this lack of value alignment. So I did something about it. I'm quite an action-led person. So in that instance, I decided to travel the world, retrain as a coach. And I actually did 20 countries in 20 months. Yeah, I did actually, yeah. And that's a story for another day. But it gave me perspective and created mental space for me to really plot and plan intentionally what my next steps were. So upon my return back to work a few years later, I was very aware of how I wanted to be in a position to run a business, but I needed a stepping stone to get there. So I joined a very entrepreneurial, privately owned business, of which I'm still a shareholder, and spent my career there really enjoying that entrepreneurial, high growth, small business vibe that Octopus, the company you might have heard of, presents. And that gave me a real opportunity. But there began my journey into burnout number 2, where I was pretty exhausted when it came down to masking something called endometriosis, which is a chronic illness, and navigating pain and challenges around fertility and pregnancy. It all became a bit too much. And there began the thinking behind 50/50 to really understand how can we support people to come to work, deliver their best work when they're unpacking so many things in their private life and so much is going on, because that performance cannot be sustained if we're running in all of our worlds that we live in at that frenetic pace for a very long period of time. So that's really to share with you that I understand the journey. I've trained as a coach. I'm an ICF accredited coach. We have about 15 coaches on the team here at 50/50 and some psychotherapists too. We're all professionally accredited. It's really important to me that in an unregulated space that we are. I've also taken extra courses to build my CPD around neuroscience, positive psychology, and really interesting, obviously, the burnout area. And for me, this is a real life mission to be able to share with you some of the tools and techniques of what we need to do. So I'm going to share my screen again, so I can talk you through some of the key areas that we're going to talk about. So just give me a sec. Feel free to drop a note in the chat if you're listening. Let me know where you're dialing in from this evening. That would be great. Okay. So within the space of 50/50 and how we coach, I always use this rewire framework. This is something that I've devised. It's really powerful, and in our longer programs we would go through the whole process. So really, rewire is an acronym to talk about the core areas of which I believe we need to think about when it comes to elevating performance in a sustainable fashion so that we don't burn out. So we want to be able to recognise very early on in the journey those early signs of fatigue, the friction, that performance drag, really very much from a personal standpoint. And if you're working within a team or managing a team, to really be thinking about it from that lens as well. You need to calm your mind and your body. You need to calm your body before you calm your mind. So emotional regulation is the next, piece of the puzzle. So being able to lead with composure and clarity, really managing that pressure and understanding how to respond, overreact. So this is kind of like very high level on the pillars, but it will help you to put it into context. We need to look at workload and boundaries as well. So this is about energy management as well. So not necessarily this whole time management, which is pretty historic, but thinking about energy leaks, energy plugs, how can we prioritize and lead with impact, and how do we kind of get rid of that decision fatigue that can plague all of us. Identity and values comes next. And obviously I've touched on some of that already with my story, but reconnecting to an authentic leadership style, finding your why. What is it that you get out of bed for every morning? I always ask like multiple whys on that question, because you want to dig down to what is it that you want. So not, for example, I always give this basic one, but not why do you want to lose weight, or because I just want to lose weight. People just have a sort of a very vague idea on that. And then it's like, because I want to feel better in my clothes. Why? Because I want to look better. Why? Because I want to feel more confident in myself. Why? Because that will make you show up differently. So that drill down is really important, and that will fuel your long-term motivation. So when it dips, you can connect that back. And also we need to reframe our thinking, but equally redefine our performance lens. So really thinking about that sustainable high impact. This is a really big part of the program. This is about all those cultures out there that are talking about high performance cultures. They're missing the sustainable word. And that's where we come in, and that's how we can really work with organizations and individuals on that point. So this is about high impact results for everybody. And it doesn't just limit itself to work, because everything is integrated. And then we need to really think about embedding this knowledge to create the transformation. So that means, what can we take from a learning theoretical standpoint and put that into, a daily habit or activity or an approach from an individual team standpoint that can actually create those sustainable results that we want to see. So the next part of what we're going to look at is, we'll start with what burnout actually is, and we'll look into the different types of burnout. We'll look at how long it can take for burnout to show up, and we will look into some of the signs and symptoms as well of burnout. Now, first up is the World Health Organization definition. So as a syndrome, it's conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress. Note the term workplace stress there, that has not been successfully managed. And it's characterized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from a job, or feelings of that negativity and that cynic that can come out, and also the reduced professional efficacy. So they say that burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context, and it shouldn't be used to be applied to describe different experiences in other areas of life. So pretty much a workplace phenomenon. Now, personally, I think that's a bit of a limiting definition. I think some of us can have our jobs pretty much well handled, but it can be really difficult to navigate that when we've got competing priorities externally. So when I was going through my endometriosis diagnosis, being told I might not ever have a child, which was really difficult for me to work with, and then really understanding what that journey was looking like for me, that wasn't anything to do with work, but that was everything to do with who I am as an individual, and how I therefore will show up at work, and how capable I am to keep going when everything hits at once. And there are other people, if you think about it, and you might be one of them, who might be dealing with an invisible illness or a chronic illness. You might be struggling with your neurodivergence. You might be dealing with caring for a loved one, be them elderly or disabled in that way. And it's a real challenge to really understand how we can prioritize ourselves and our work and everything else that we have going on. So something to be aware of, what the World Health Organization definition is, but not something to see as the only definition. Interestingly, burnout is not a medical health condition. Sorry, it's not a medical condition, and it's also not a mental health condition. I mixed the two there, didn't I? So I'm not here as someone who can diagnose burnout. And that's not my role. My role really is to work with people like yourselves to deepen awareness, so we can take action to stop it in its tracks. Or if you've already been there and you're in the thick of it or in the throes of it, to work with you to successfully sort of recover through the burnout journey, because it's quite specific. It's quite a specific space to be working with a coach. Traditional coaching methodologies do not work for burnout. And actually, it's very, very dangerous when you see people, especially on LinkedIn, talking about their work with burnout and within the space of burnout, but they don't have any professional qualifications around that space, and they haven't really studied into that area. Because from a coaching standpoint, your usual push, push, push up the performance curve to the optimal place, which we'll come on to in a moment, you actually need at some point to start pushing people back as opposed to continuing moving them forward. So those usual, traditional goals and I guess more doing energy becomes redundant. So it's not a medical condition. It's not something that is considered to be a mental health condition. I'm not able to diagnose it. You'll find it quite difficult to be diagnosed. If you do go to a GP, They might use a traditional DSM-5 approach to the sort of the questionnaires that you might get if you were dealing with anxiety or depression. And that has limitations in its own right. So it is a tricky area, and it requires more education, and it requires a little bit of a careful approach. Before we go on to stress, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the signs and symptoms of burnout. So we actually referred to some of them here, didn't we? There were a couple of here around this mental distancing. This is a really popular term and it's come from this World Health Organization definition. If you think about it, it's that kind of disconnection that you're feeling when you're moving through that journey of going from a place of, if we look at this scale here, probably more from that pressure into one of strain or ultimately burnout. So there's a spectrum here, and this is what's really important. It's dynamic. The stress scale from sort of a 0 to 10 will be something that you will fluctuate between every single day. Not one day will ever be the same as what you are experiencing here. So when you're thinking about where you are on that stress scale, you'll begin to see the signs and symptoms that come up for you with regards to how it's showing up and how it's manifesting day to day. So some great ones would be around that bone crunching fatigue that you cannot shift. So no matter how much you sleep, you can't seem to shake that exhaustion. You might be feeling really brittle and snappy. So how are you reacting, and reacting being the operative word here, to your partner every evening, to your children, and potentially to your work colleagues as well? How tolerant do you feel you are when you're driving the car and you're caught in a traffic jam, or you're in a queue that's going very slowly and someone's counting out their change? Do you notice yourself being really easy and ready to flip and kind of get into a kind of anger state? Or do you feel a little bit more that you're in a space of distancing and you're kind of checking out? Because that's also a sign as well. So we can kind of remove ourselves from social interactions, from work drinks, from work socials, from any form of energy that I guess we need to give when we haven't got much left to give. We can't really be giving more, so we step away from it. We might shut down conversations with the loved ones that we have in our lives or people that know us really well because we don't want to go there. It can manifest in all sorts of physical ways as well. So it can show up as sort of, like a really tight shoulders, permanent headache, dry mouth. You might be dealing with breakouts from your skin. You might have a really sore stomach. You might be dealing with some allergies coming through or some intolerances showing up. It really can manifest its way in so many different ways. And then you obviously have the mental health side as well, where you might be really exhausted from the overthinking, from the over sort of the almost anxiety or stress that the anxiety or depression that some of this stress may bring on for you. So lots of examples of that, and some of the ones that stick out for me most are the sort of being brittle, ready to snap, like that elastic band that's been stretched for far too long. So have a think about these calm, pressure, strain, burnout zones. We want to be in a space where the pressure is optimal, where we're getting the most from our energy expenditure. We want to be focused, driven. We want to have that success in both the short and long term. And we want to feel challenged. We want that productivity to kind of be there. And of course, we want the clear thinking, the balanced energy, and the good sleep, but that doesn't always happen. But that isn't a prerequisite to be optimal in our performance either. When we get into that irritability, maybe our focus has been really, pulled in multiple directions. A lot of context shifting goes on for a lot of people, or switching, we should say. So when people are moving into different contexts all the time, so think from parenting to caring for an elderly, to working, to being you, that all requires energy. And there are some stats, actually, I think I've got it written down here. We lose 40% of productivity when we do context switch, or we do focus switch. So that's like a real sign that interruptions and lack of focus can really impact us on our performance level. And from a focus standpoint, we're much less likely to be focused if we're higher stressed. And if we've got an average tendency to switch focus anyway, which most people have, there are some reports that say most workers try and switch between tasks every 3 minutes, which is crazy. And a big part of the work we do around that performance redesign module here at 50/50 is very much around how to overcome some of these challenges. But it's, yeah, an average of 3 minutes. It's crazy. So we need to be thinking about, is our focus being interrupted all the time? Poor boundaries, are we sort of, you know, have poor boundaries with ourselves and also with others? And then that's when you start to see that strain. When you feel strained, you might be using the words like stretched. I feel quite pulled in multiple directions. I haven't got much more to give. I don't know how much more I can take. I don't really know what more you want me to say. These are kind of indication moments for us all to be mindful of. And that fatigue, that bone-crunching tiredness that's beyond being tired, that might mean that you can't even get to sleep, or when you do, you are waking up early in the morning, having those sort of night terrors, or having sort of nocturnal panic attacks, which can be very real too for people with stress. So these are the things to be thinking about, because these are the early red flags that we can kind of stop burnout before we hit that top end of the stress scale. Because when we do reach burnout, and if we want to think about a scale of 0 to 10, burnout is when we kind of go off the scale. Burnout is when we are completely at rock bottom, we've fallen off the cliff, and we have nothing left to give. We are running on empty. And I talk about it all the time. If you follow me on LinkedIn, which I know many of you will, this about silly season is about to kick in. This is so easy to happen to all of us. Even people like me who have a really good awareness of burnout, we still get to that place where I would use the language flirt with burnout a lot. Tiptoe around that edge of the cliff. Pull ourselves back, and knowing how to do that effectively is the key to not falling off. And that's really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and some of you will have seen this already, the Yerkes-Dodson law bell curve. This is the pressure performance curve, and really important to think about the scale of stress. So from 0 to 10, if that's the scale, this is the kind of zones that we're in. So 0 to 2 is a form of burnout in its own right. And there are 3 types of burnout, bore-out being one of them. So 0, 1, 2 out of 10, this is when you're so unmotivated, you cannot get yourself out of bed in the morning. You're struggling to engage, to feel energized to do your job. And often when it comes to work, it's around the fact that you're probably doing something quite repetitive, boring, mundane, and interestingly, very likely to be underutilizing your skill set, not reaching your potential. So that is critical to understand. And if you feel like you're in that space, be mindful that a low score on the stress scale can also be burnout. Now, the healthy zone, as you can see, is 3 to 7 out of 10. And we want to be hanging out here. This is the optimal performance. You can see the top of the bell curve is where we want to be hanging out before we reach into diminishing returns. So 3 to 7 out of 10 would be where we want to be. Now, that isn't to say that we're all kind of going to live this perfect life where we hang out in an optimal zone, a healthy zone of stress at all times. It's not possible. We have curveballs, we have weddings, we have divorces, we move houses, we have children, we have relationship breakdowns, we go through health issues and diagnoses of terminal illnesses, we go through losing loved ones and grief. There are so many things we deal with as human, as an emotional human, that we're always going to have spikes in our, in the pressure that we're experiencing and the stress we're under. And what the important point is if we think about the elastic band and the stretch that we have, that we can actually find ways to bring ourselves back into the healthy zone. And that comes in the form of rest, recovery, and being very conscious of the red flags that we have. So the other two types of burnout, one I touched on earlier, that was moral injury burnout, sometimes referred to as worn out burnout as well. And that's really common in professions where people are quite altruistic by nature. So teachers, nurses, those working in care homes typically will experience a burnout. Often it doesn't help that they're often very underpaid for the roles that they're doing as well. So there's a real value misalignment there as well that can kind of, people often are not in that job because they're getting a lot of money from it. They're in that job because they really care and they really want to do that. And if you're on the call today and you're in one of these roles, this might really resonate for you. For me, I was working in a very capitalist banking environment, so I couldn't really say that that altruistic culture was something that was present for me. However, my values as an individual, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something with my life where I could be proud of my legacy. I wanted more. I wanted to achieve transformation. I wanted to help people in their worlds and with their lives. And I wasn't going to do that by selling investment funds in that particular road that I was kind of working towards leadership, management, and so forth within a corporate banking environment. So that would be something to think about. That's a type of burnout that is good to be aware of. And then the final one is probably the one that we're most aware of. I would call it frenetic burnout. And this is the push, 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 do style of burnout. This is where we see things like addiction to laptops, an ever needing, desire, never able to stop turning the phone over. Someone who's like secretly looking at their phone when they're at dinner with friends to try not to look, rude, or constantly checking their Apple Watch or similar whilst you're in a conversation at a coffee shop, constantly checking in on what's being sent or said. Sometimes it might be reading a book with a child and kind of trying to get that, straining your neck just to see if anything's pinged through on your laptop. And these behaviours are sort of this frenetic kind of constant, always on, keep pushing, keep going style of burnout is, I guess, what we talk about most. But it's really important to think about the other types as well. So we know the burnout definition by the WHO. We've understood the 3 different types of burnout. We know that there's a scale, a stress scale, and this is a really good tool for you to think about. And I'd really encourage you to think, where do you place yourself on this stress curve today? Do you sit in a bore out or potential burnout zone? Are you hanging out in the 8, 9, and 10 zone a bit too much, which is going to push you more towards the potential of burnout and falling off the cliff? Are you quite happily in your healthy zone, but you know you've got a lot coming up over the next few weeks as we get towards Christmas? We're now in November, believe it or not. So just be really conscious of where you're at and take a moment to be truthful with yourself. There's some real nuances with, I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a bit. There's some real nuances with the way that burnout will show up for individuals. It will be quite different. And you have to really tune into yourself and be really open with yourself and be really honest. There's no point sitting there and sort of just being, I don't know, just telling yourself the story. But there is an element around the stress. And when we look at the stress, we think about why we can't own up to it in the moment, because there's a whole neuroscience that kind of underpins how burnout manifests for most of us and how it shows up, and often why you can't think yourself out of burnout. And that's really important to understand. In its own right, the whole neuroscience element of burnout is way beyond a session in its own right. And it's something we really delve into deeply in our programs here at 50/50. And it's got a real value add to it, because once you understand the neuroscience, you can kind of get your head around why people just keep going when they know they should stop. Because ultimately, you do hear people say that, don't you? You do hear people say, well, if you know you're doing too much, why can't you just stop? You just need to take a break. But I'll come on to that in a moment as to why that is quite scary, and also fairly impossible. So when it comes to regulating stress, there are quite a few tools that we can take into place. And obviously, I really want you to think about the bell curve and the stress scale as your first tool to really use, because this is something that you can kind of check in with yourself daily. And getting yourself into a habit of doing this every day will get you to be much more conscious and aware and intentional with how you spend your energy. I'd also be asking you, where are you leaking energy? And if you're thinking back to the rewire pillars, is it around identity and values? Is it more workload and boundaries? Is it around the recognizing the signs early enough? Whatever you are kind of showing up and manifesting from an energy leak standpoint, these are what lead us to a burnout. And I want you to get really conscious of where you're spending your energy, where it's leaking, and then therefore we can help plug them. Now, for those of you that haven't done it already, I do have an energy leak quiz, which can give you a high level view of where you are leaking energy. So email me after the session if you want that, and I will send you personally the link, and you can do that, and you'll get a personalized report giving you a couple of tidbits on how to handle it as well. If you're also receiving my stress busters effectively this week, we're going through some tools and techniques that we can use for that as well, which is really good. So on to how we can handle some of this stress before I touch a little bit on the neuroscience. So one of the best tools that you will have heard probably many a time talked about, but probably never seen a visual as cool as this, and I cannot take any credit for it. It really is brilliant. I'm going to share my screen again because I just think it's so visual. And also, if you're neurodivergent, this is a really good way to understand visually and see everything together. And it's just not one of those normal, boring mental health first aid ones where it's sort of done a bit clunky. Did I say that? Not sure I did. Let me just do this here. So let's put this back on slideshow mode. This is Dr. Juliet Young, and she is also known as the creative psychotherapist, or she's a creative clinical psychologist, as you can see here by her handle, which is at the bottom of the picture. But this is a really, really good visual of the stress bucket. And I talk about it a lot. In fact, for my coaching sessions, I've always got a glass here with a visual of all the stressors that we're putting into our glass at any given time. And I want you to think about the fact that we all have a capacity to cope with stress. And some of that is DNA, some of that is conditioning, some of it's lived experience, and a lot of it is about what we're dealing with at work and in the moment. So your bucket will be different to my bucket, and what's going into it will be very distinct as well. But everything from the minute we wake up every single day is a stressor. Now, it's not stress in its own right, it's just a stressor. So that could be from things that are going on around, what do I wear this morning? What am I going to say in my meeting this morning I'm presenting? To, what should we have for breakfast? Or have I got the kids' lunches sorted? Whatever it might be that's going on for you, all these are like little drips going into your bucket, filling it up day to day. And the water and the stress, and then the bigger stuff starts to happen. So these micro stresses are kind of building up. So there's always a base layer of water in your tank or in your bucket. And then we have the bigger kind of droplets of water coming into the tank. And that would be family stress, that big presentation you're giving. Maybe it's an interview. Perhaps you're really stressed about the budget, worried about the impact of that on the business and your job. Perhaps you're thinking you're really upset about all the wars, and you're upset about the situation with politics globally. These are big things that kind of going to add into your stress bucket. Now, how we regulate this stress and how we download our stress is something that we often can't do when we're in a burnout state. So the best way to de-stress is to sleep. Now, the first thing to go when we get very, very stressed and we're in a burnout zone is our sleep. So it's kind of a vicious circle that we're experiencing. So what we end up doing is not sleeping, putting more pressure on ourselves, and then trying to alleviate some of that pressure and taking some of that weight off by some unhelpful coping mechanisms. And that's here depicted by the tap on the left as we look at the screen, where it's effectively releasing some of the water from the bucket, but effectively it's like putting a little hose pipe on the bottom of it for it to go straight back into our stress and top our stress levels back up again. Now, these will be things that you'll be very familiar with, things that we all do, things that without being very conscious, we don't think twice about sometimes. And it might be, having that one extra glass of wine at night. It might be going to the gym a lot more than you normally would. There's some very serious ones in here, like drugs and self-harm. But it also might be about taking risks and kind of, pushing those boundaries a bit more. And this is ways that we will cope, but this is unhelpful. Add into that a trauma trigger. So you might have stuff coming up from you from previous situations. Someone at work might be triggering you based on what's going on. You might have some memories that are coming up for you based on a current situation. And there might be feelings of shame or guilt or negative sort of areas that are coming back into your life. And that can add in more stress to your stress bucket as well. So what we want to be doing is finding helpful coping mechanisms. And obviously they're going to be rooted around sleep and rest, but also recovery. And I think one important point here is that rest does not equal doing nothing. And there's a real distinction here because a lot of people see rest as, and I certainly did this in my first career at HSBC, which was like, I had a mantra, I'll sleep when I'm dead. I'll keep going. I worked hard. I played hard. It was kind of like I wore burnout as a badge of honor. Like I really saw, like if I was exhausted, then obviously I was doing something well. I had this whole work hard reward mechanism in place where if I wasn't pushing myself, then, surely I wasn't working hard enough. And that's so true for many of us. So finding ways where we can kind of reclaim the narrative and the story we tell ourselves around this position, the positioning of this is really important. So we want to be doing active rest. Perhaps that means walking. Perhaps that means going out without your phone. Perhaps that means having a great conversation with someone you care about and laughing. Connectivity and community are so important to feel that we belong. It might be really thinking about your values and bringing things into your life where your values are topped up. So if you don't feel value aligned in your work, and helping people is important, perhaps there's some volunteering you can do to kind of realign some of those values, even if you can't change your work for whatever reason that might be. So these are helpful coping mechanisms that we need to be really conscious of and think about when it comes to how we handle our stress. But the important thing from a burnout standpoint is that we can't really keep going in the same way. Now I'll explain that. I'm going to stop the share again. So when we're in burnout, we're not able to get the sleep we need, first and foremost. So that means we're in a space where we're not downloading the stresses of the day. We're not putting to sleep some of the upset and the stress and the trauma that we've experienced throughout the day. So when we wake up the next morning, our stress bucket doesn't just have the normal small layer of stressors in, as that sort of small level of water in the bucket. It ends up being in a space where the bucket's half full already. And as this stress builds and as you move up that stress scale, the water is overflowing as you're waking up. And this is why people get to a place where there have been lots of warning signs, but they have been ignored. Some of it will be psychologically true based on how the neuroscience of the brain will kind of impact how you understand burnout and how you show up with it. But equally, it's about how you understand that actually I'm going through this right now. I haven't noticed it, and I feel like, and you hear this a lot, I just crept up on me overnight, or I don't know where, it was just out of the blue. All of a sudden, one day I just couldn't put the next foot in front of the other, or one day I just collapsed, or one day I was pouring a glass of water and I couldn't lift the water up to my mouth. I just couldn't do it. And this is because we get to a place where we cannot physically go any further. And this comes back to the point I made earlier about not having any more in the tank to give. So you can imagine that if we're not finding ways to get rid of some of that stress early, we will end up in that space where we wake up in the morning with our tank overflowing. And I think that's really, really, really something to think about. And this is always a reminder to me, just seeing this in here, all the different stresses that I have in the glass. And when it starts overflowing, I've got to find ways to take things out off my plate. I have to. There's no alternative. So that's really something to be thinking about. How we use the stress bucket is to find ways for us that are meaningful, that can remove the stress in a healthy way, and stop doing some of the unhealthy tasks, or sorry, not tasks, but unhealthy things that we do to handle stress day to day. So I'm just going to keep this next bit. So I'm just looking at the time. So yeah, we're doing good. I'll be able to come on to some questions soon. So if you have got questions, drop them in the chat. I've actually had a couple come through personally already, so I'm going to look at those in a moment. When it comes to the neuroscience piece, you can't think yourself out of burnout. And I think that's just such a good way of understanding it, because burnout isn't actually happening in your mind, it's actually happening in your nervous system. It's a whole physiological nervous system shutdown. And that's why we kind of get to this place where we're in this fight, flight, freeze response, and you've been going on in that for too long, in this high stress kind of, you know, chronic stress space, because chronic stress emerges when we hang out in the 8, 9, 10 zone for way too long. And when we then obviously go beyond that, we then enter burnout, which, as I said, is the fall off the cliff. So when you're under chronic stress, your brain's alarm system, so the amygdala, that goes into absolute overdrive, and it floods the body with cortisol. And you'll be aware of this, and all the adrenaline that it does. And this is to keep you primed and prepped and ready for threat. Your body sees and feels that you are under threat when you're in this space of high stress. But at the same time, the part of the brain that we call the prefrontal cortex, that's the bit that's responsible for the logic, the planning, the empathy, and like sort of our ability to problem solve, to be innovative, to be creative in our thinking, to overcome roadblocks. When that literally goes offline, and it's doing it to conserve energy. So it's why we forget things when we're really stressed, or we drop a ball. I always use that language as well. It's like, oh, I'm dropping balls. And I know it's because I've got too much on my on my plate, and I've got too much to do. I often talk about working out which balls you can drop. Again, thinking about removing stuff from the stress bucket, removing stuff from our plate, taking off the load from our shoulders. Whatever analogy works for you, we need to remove. And this ability to forget things is much more present, or overreact. We might just be so reactive in the moment, really like ready to pounce on anyone that might say anything to us for whatever reason it might be. Or you're just in a total zone of decision fatigue. You're like overwhelmed. It's Friday night. You've got a menu in front of you at the pub. You're trying to decide what to eat, and you cannot even read the words on the menu. You cannot even choose your dinner. Please choose for me. I can't even make a decision. And this happens a lot in leadership as well. If we're constantly making decisions at work, sometimes we don't want to do it for ourselves. And actually, we can't do it in this situation. So when we're under pressure, we're kind of switched from a thinking and an intellectual brain to more of a primitive brain where it's all wired around survival, dating back to caveman times where it's all about survival. You don't want to be under threat. Your body sees it as threat. Therefore, everything else needs to kind of be completely wired to release whatever you don't need so you can survive. It's why some of us will get a really dodgy stomach before a big meeting or get very nervous. People say that their bowels open when they're really scared. We see that in movies, don't we? With someone's being a hostage or something, they might wet themselves. And this is because it's our body's way of flushing out anything that isn't needed when we're in a high stress environment. Because the lighter, the freer, the more empty the body is, the more likely it is to survive. So this is when you say to someone, oh, just calm down, or think positive, it doesn't work because the thinking brain isn't there. It's offline. Imagine it like literally no Wi-Fi connection, cannot reach it. So you have to get into a space where you calm the body first before you calm the brain, because the brain will follow once we calm the brain, can't calm the body. And this is where we talk about, through the rewire programs, 50/50, this is the kind of thing that we do to rewire the nervous system as well, because we have to rebuild the focus from inside out. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. So we've given you this as a bit of a teaser, I guess, to understand that this is a massive subject area in its own right. But this is why we can't think ourselves out of burnout. So often, if you want to play that into somebody who might be a high performer, who's always on, who might be running around, being very, very busy, doing lots of doing and pushing all the way through, probably not getting the sleep, but also still effectively functioning, they could be in a sort of that chronic stress cycle where they just rewired their benchmark. So healthy for them isn't really a 3 to 7 anymore. Healthy for them could well be an 8 or a 9, but actually they're very close to burnout all the time. And that's an interesting perspective to share, and one that often is tied up with, there's an addiction to work, and now there's a kind of a fear that I can't stop and I won't stop. And actually, it wouldn't work to talk to someone about that in that way. You'd have to do something that we call breadcrumbing to try and open up awareness, rather than really thinking about, oh, come on, you really need to take a break now. Because their interpretation of that is, oh, that's not a safe response for me. I'm not going to do that, because if I do that, then no, that's not going to work. And this is what we need to avoid doing. Yet at the same time, that's the only way most of us think about how to support someone. Or you come on, you've done enough now. You need to stop. But that's not going to land. So if you're thinking that way yourself, you half the time you're not even aware that you're there until you're off the cliff. So we've run through so much information already. We've talked about the WHO definition. We know the 3 different types of burnout. We've explored the performance and pressure curve and the optimal performance zone. We've thought about the actual stress scale itself and how you might use that to recognize where you are day to day. We've touched on some of this neuroscience around why it's difficult to think your way out of burnout, and how traditional methods of coaching won't work, and how it can be very dangerous, and you can kind of be in a very high state of chronic stress for some time for some people. We've looked at tools to regulate, such as the stress bucket, and I'm going to give you another one now. So another one to really think about. This is a great one for the parasympathetic nervous system because it activates it. It's a tool called the double exhale reset. Now, you might have heard of this as something called the physiological sigh. So this is where we do 2 inhales quite quickly through the nose, and then a slow exhale through the mouth. And this is a tool that's been developed by a guy called Andrew Huberman. It's a Stanford study of 2023, and yeah, this is really used with very high pressure, high performance environments. So it's really good to think about. So they use it in NASA. It's used with top athletes globally. And it's better than things like box breathing, which you might have heard of, which is where you're kind of doing the 4, the 4, the 4, the 4. So you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. You kind of do that. I think this is much better because it's a bit quicker. So it also reduces the CO2 backup that you have, and it does this signal to the brain. And this is what we want. We want the brain to think we're safe. The brain doesn't think we're safe when we're in burnout. The brain doesn't think we're safe when we're in chronic stress. If we can fool the brain, because the brain only knows what we signal to it, then we can, physically signal to the brain that we're safe and we're okay. And this is the quickest way and the best way to do it. So if you want to try it now, if you would just breathe in deeply through your nose, and then you want to top it up with a tiny little inhale, like a second inhale. So it's a deep one in, and then a little shorter one afterwards. And then you want to slowly exhale through your mouth. And I always say as long as you can on the exhale. Always longer than inhales, but as long as you can. And you want to do this 2, maybe 3 times, and then you'll notice, if you do it now, you close your eyes, you put your 2 feet on the floor, relax your shoulders and just sort of sit there. You'll notice that if you're in a stress situation to start with and you do this, great to do with kids as well, by the way, then your shoulders will drop almost instantly. And then again, that's almost like your cue that the nervous system is resetting. So when the brain gets the message, I'm safe, it gives you that, it frees up your capacity to focus, for creativity, for innovation and decision making. And that's what we want. We want to get ourselves switched out of that primitive mind and back into the intellectual place of the brain, where we can start to make all the decisions that we need to do and think in a way that is helpful for us. So yes, that's another great tool there. So I think I'm going to wrap up now. So we've got all the tools. We've talked through all the different types of burnout and what have you. So I've got a couple of questions. Are there any more questions that you would like to share? Let me know, but I've got a couple that I really, yes, a really good question coming through. Someone said, my picture of burnout had always been someone who's working crazy hours rather than just doing something that doesn't relate to your values. Yeah, exactly that. That frenetic burnout is the kind of one the media gets behind. But actually, moral injury is really interesting based on where you are at personally. And equally, bore-out as well. Who knew that you could be burnt out from doing nothing? But actually, it's very, very real. So I've got a question here. What are some of the early warning signs people miss, especially high performers? High performance is an interesting one. It's definitely an area of passion of mine. I think for high performance, the first signals aren't always exhaustion. They can be really subtle because you're so used to pushing through on that. It might be like a bit of foggy brain, like what I refer to, having had a child, is baby brain, that kind of fogginess in the brain. Maybe you're like really hesitating over what would be a normal task for you, an easy task, or maybe you're like finding yourself needing a lot more attention than you normally would do. So also losing patience can be a really big tell. So remember, burnout starts in the nervous system, so it's going to start there before it's showing up in your performance at work. This is a good one. How can I stay calm and focused when I cannot change my workload? You can't always control, I guess, what you're given by your boss. Hopefully you've got a psychologically safe workplace, or you're creating one where people can say, hey, I've got too much going on. You need to regulate the nervous system. Again, I'll keep coming back to this. The short resets, the tools for breathing, and the movement breaks, active rest, getting yourself moving and out of the sort of office environment. That's really good. And so forth. So any more questions, pop them through. I'll always take them afterwards as well. So you can always drop me an email and I'll do those as well. One thing before we wrap up is I just want to share with you a couple of QR